Hi there and welcome back once more to the shortest history of Britain. In this episode we step into the 1700s. As we enter into the Georgian era of British history, we see a period of incredible social change, reform and revolution. The shift from where the nation stands on the first day of the year 1700 to where we are on the last is seismic. The Age of Enlightenment was upon us, and the Empire of Britain was about to expand its reach beyond that of any other. Now, when we enter the year 1700, William of Orange is still on the throne of England and held control over its territories. His marriage to Mary II, who he had co-reigned with until her death, had not produced any children, so there was no heir apparent to the throne. In 1702, William died and remained the only holder of the crown of Britain from the Dutch House of Orange. The daughter of Charles II, Anne, ascended to the throne as Queen of Great Britain. Whilst Ireland was under English control and Wales was indeed simply considered part of England at that time, Scotland was still independent and wished to continue the Stuart line of monarchs. Mary made it clear early in her reign that she intended to join the nations in a union under one monarch and one parliament and one rule of law. Scotland put forth its proposals to this negotiation, and an agreement was reached that should Anne not have a child to succeed her, then the Scots would be free to choose their own Scottish successor, who would not be the same individual to hold the crown of England. England, in turn, created a bill in response to this, which deemed that all Scottish men and women would be seen as illegal aliens in the country should this Scottish proposal be pushed through, along with also a number of other economic sanctions against the country. In the end, the Scottish repealed their bill and the English repealed theirs, and on the 1st of May 1707, the Acts of Union came into effect, formally joining the two nations as Great Britain, along with their respective parliaments, also under what is known as the Union of the Parliaments. Anne's parliaments continued on with the two-party system we discussed in the previous episode, and that which defines the system even today in various other countries too. The Tories were supportive of the Anglican Church and the landed gentry, while the Whigs on the other side were more aligned with commercial interests. Now, at this time over in Spain, Charles II of Spain had died without a successor, and so began the huge wars of Spanish succession, played out in various theatres of war across the world and featuring in part the kingdoms of Spain, France, the Roman Empire, Prussia, and the Dutch Republic. Britain was waging war against the French and the Spanish in the colonies of what would become the United States in what was known as the Third Indian War, or more commonly referred to sometimes as Queen Anne's War. The French and the Spanish were allied for much of this conflict, with the third belligerent in the war, the Iroquois Confederacy, often referred to as the Five Nations. The French forces and their native allies launched a series of savage attacks on various English outposts there, and a violent and bloody war began to unfold until in 1710 the British and their allies took the French Port Royal in the region of Arcadia, which would go on to become Nova Scotia under British rule, which of course is Latin for New Scotland, so it would go along with this region of New England in the northeast of the States. The conflicts resulted in a number of peace agreements and the colonisation of various parts of the country, split between the English, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch and the native people too. Britain took most of the eastern seaboard, which formed the majority of the states which had been reached at that time, including up into Canada. The French took a great hold across Canada, and much of it is still French-speaking to this day, while the Spanish took Florida and the deep south down through Texas and, of course, into Central and South America. The Portuguese also colonized parts of South America too, but they never really extended their reach much further northwards. Despite being remembered in mixed terms for her reign, some putting forth that Queen Anne lacked any particular skill at running the country, The stability and prosperity of her time on the throne had allowed the nation to flourish under her. The construction of Blenheim Palace and the introduction of what would be remembered as Queen Anne-style architecture and Queen Anne-style furniture would add further to her legacy. Writers like Daniel Defoe and Jonathan Swift, Alexander Pope were becoming huge names whose works survive well to this day, and the country was ready to take its next great step forward. Anne died in 1714 after a life of ill health. Jonathan Swift himself wrote that, quote, "Sleep was never more welcome to a weary traveller than death was to her." The Act of Settlement that the Parliaments of England and Scotland had agreed on named Electra Sophia of Hanover as their heir to the throne. She was the granddaughter of James I of England, or James VI of Scotland. But she had just died a short while earlier, and so it was her son George who would take the throne. He was crowned George I of Great Britain and Ireland in October 1714, and would begin a long line of Georges who would therefore create what we know today as the Georgian era of British history. George was the first of the kings from the House of Hanover of German descent, and he struggled throughout his reign with many parts of his role. The German monarch was an absolute ruler in Germany with absolute control over the land, whereas in Britain the monarch ruled through the Parliament. In the general election of the year of George's coronation, the Whigs won a majority, and with George's support and his mistrust of the Tories, they clung to that majority for over half a century. George was unpopular amongst the people throughout his reign. He didn't learn to speak fluent English, so he couldn't communicate effectively, and he distanced himself further from the population. He had a rather poor relationship with his son, George, Prince of Wales, who also actively pursued opposition to many of his father's policies as king, and it would be years before a forced reconciliation would take place. Following a period of financial instability with the deaths of a number of George's senior cabinet ministers, a young Sir Robert Walpole stood out as the most senior and trusted of George's politicians. Despite having previously stood down from his role, he returned to the cabinet in 1719 and 2 years later in 1721 was appointed First Lord of the Treasury, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the leader of the House of Commons, effectively making him the country's first de facto Prime Minister. Walpole was a very powerful politician, able to trade orders of chivalry for supporters, and was largely able to appoint his own ministers. George rarely attended meetings of the cabinet and was increasingly ridiculed by the people as lacking intelligence, and on the 11th of June 1727, George I died and was succeeded by his still somewhat estranged son, George, Prince of Wales, though Robert Walpole had taken some steps to restore their relationship before he passed. His son would be crowned George II, and Sir Robert Walpole kept his job as Prime Minister. George II is remembered as, again, a rather ineffective king, not entirely unlike his father. He too quarrelled with his own son, Frederick, who also went on to join an anti-administration group, as George II had to his own father. George II took a backseat, little more than a ceremonial figure, leaving the organisation of the nation and its foreign policies to Sir Robert Walpole. George's son, Frederick, actively campaigned against Walpole in the 1741 general election, and Walpole lost his majority. The following year, with the grasp on Parliament fading, he resigned from his post after over 20 years in charge. With the Jacobite uprising still going strong in Scotland, this great push for the return to the line of the House of Stuart and the return of a Catholic king, King James II's grandson Charles landed in Scotland as the young pretender. Charles Edward Louis John Casimir Sylvester Severino Maria Stuart by birth. He would be known here as Bonnie Prince Charlie. In 1745, he launched the first offensive from Glenfinnan in the Highlands, fighting the Battle of Prestonpans in East Lothian and capturing Edinburgh from the royal forces. A plan was formed to move south into England, acting simultaneously with a French invasion from the south, and Bonnie Prince Charlie's forces got as far as Derby that December before turning back. In April of the following year, the forces met at the Battle of Culloden near Inverness. It was the last ever pitched or set-piece battle to take place on British soil. The British army were larger, better equipped, and well rested, and after less than an hour, they destroyed the rebelling forces. Bonnie Prince Charlie fled to France, and the cause for reinstating the line of Stuart was gone forever. By 1760, King George II was blind in one eye and nearly deaf, having lived to an age of 77, longer than any British, English, or Scottish monarch had before him. He died in his quarters that year and was succeeded by his grandson, who would be King George III, leading on with our Georgian period here. Now, whilst also King of Hanover, as his two predecessors had been, the difference was that George III was born in England. He spoke English as his first language, and he didn't once travel to Hanover. The beginning of his reign also marks the start of what we know as the Industrial Revolution, a shift from the previous hand-worked machines and methods to full machinery, steam-powered machinery, water-powered machinery, and this rise of mechanized factories. What began in England in the mid-1700s led to the nation becoming the world's leading dominant commercial force by the mid-1800s, with a global trading empire across every continent. It was a turning point in history. Nearly every facet of daily life was affected in some manner. Population, standard of living, GDP all rose, and sustainably. Economic historians often claim that it was the most important period of human history since the first domestication of animals. And with it came the agricultural revolution, where productivity from the land grew faster than the population, and placed the British in the leading role of agricultural performance and development, somewhat in response to the work of Jethro Tull, who'd developed the first horse-drawn seed drill, which allowed for neater, faster, more efficient sowing of crops. Also at this time was a blooming sense of Englishness, though to a lesser extent Britishness. Some of the staples of English and British life first found their footings around this sort of time. The Times newspaper was established, though initially under a different name, and just a little after the Scottish Herald, which is the single oldest national newspaper in the world and the 8th oldest daily newspaper in the world too. The grand palaces and homes of the country were landscaped by people such as Capability Brown, so nicknamed for his frequent telling to homeowners of the capability of their land to be improved. He landscaped the gardens at Blenheim Palace, Harewood House, Warwick Castle, Milton Abbey, even parts of Kew Gardens, amongst, of course, many, many more, and he made gardening and also the visiting of gardens the most English of pastimes. Artists like Constable and Turner were starting out, changing the face of British art completely. Astley's Amphitheatre was opened in 1773 on Westminster Bridge Road, the first circus ring in known history, beginning a new entertainment spectacle that would soon begin to sweep the world. The Revolution saw individuals like Hosea Wedgwood pioneer the mass manufacturing of pottery and tableware, along also with marketing techniques such as the buy one get one free offer, self-service, free delivery, the illustrated marketing catalogue, all coming from Wedgwood. Cadbury's, Fry's and Rowntree's confectionery, Clark's shoes, Barclays Bank, Lloyd's Bank, James Watt's first steam engine, his business partner Matthew Boulton's manufacturing and distribution of the steam engines for him, along with the minting of new coins and the supply of cutting-edge new equipment to the Royal Mint itself. Now, in 1763, with new Prime Minister George Grenville running Parliament, a series of proposals and acts were passed to impose taxes on the new colonies of America. Whilst the taxes weren't high, indeed they were actually very low, the colonies took issue with their lack of representation in the British Parliament, giving them no voice in matters which concerned them. Shortly afterwards, in 1765, the Sons of Liberty were formed, this group which represented the 13 colonies and fought for their rights and also against taxation. Part of the rebellion against this taxation without representation was spearheaded by the Sons of Liberty in protest to the Tea Act of 1773. Britain had rescinded much of the taxes imposed on the colonies, but the colonies did drink 1.2 million litres of tea each year, and Britain wasn't going to hand it over tax-free. The Act also allowed the East India Company to stay financially viable, to stay financially afloat, themselves struggling at the time. Now, as the tea landed in Massachusetts, the leaders of these colonies ordered it to turn back. But in 1773 in Boston, a party of around 130 men, led by Samuel Adams, some dressed in the outfits of the local Mohawk warriors, boarded 3 East India Company ships and turned 340 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. The incident was known as the Boston Tea Party, and it really began to lay the foundations for the American War of Independence. By 1775, the conflicts had begun, with incidents such as the Battle of Bunker Hill driving up support for the Patriots, as they were known. The colonies began to draw up their constitutions, to elect their own governors, and to put in place the framework to leave the rule of Britain. Congress approved the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, 1776, and in 1783, representatives of George III signed a peace treaty which granted America all lands east of the Mississippi River and recognized their independent sovereignty. That same year, George appointed the incredibly experienced William Pitt the Elder, a trusted statesman and politician, to the role of Prime Minister. This increased George's popularity amongst the people of Britain, even if not entirely amongst his own cabinet. They admired his piety and his dedication to his wife and to his children. Though Britain was involved, as most of the major European powers were, in the slave trade, more specifically known as the Atlantic slave trade. The practices had begun sometime earlier, back in the mid-1500s, by the Spanish and the Portuguese taking the inhabitants of West Africa on ships to the newly found Americas. The trade grew and formed the backbone of much of the growth and labour of these powers and their developments of the New World. Under the reign of George III in Britain, MP William Wilberforce became a vocal driving force behind the abolition of the slave trade in this country, arguing that such practices were not necessary, certainly not anymore, in order for the British Empire to retain its place at the Council of Trade on a global scale. George stood against the movement, opposing the abolitionists. William Pitt, whilst indeed supportive of abolishing the slave trade, he knew he would need to go against the king quite publicly in order to push through such actions, and so he kept the matter out of Parliament for the time being, choosing to pursue the matter himself, though, on an individual scale. It's thought that during the 60-year reign of George III, 1.6 million slaves were taken from Africa and traded or transported to British overseas colonies. The slave trade would indeed end sooner rather than later, and under the reign of George, but after the turn of the century, so that's something we'll come back to in the next episode. Back on this continent, the beginnings of the French Revolution were rumbling, and in 1789, a horde of aggrieved French civilians stormed the great Bastille fortress and prison in central Paris, and one of the most awful and bloody periods of French history began. In 1793, with their problems internally seemingly not enough for them, the French declared war on Britain. The reign of terror in France was drawing to an end, and a young Napoleon Bonaparte, the first consul of France, led a French force to British shores. What would unfold over the following years is known as the Napoleonic Wars, where the French would go to war against virtually everyone on the continent. George III and William Pitt the Elder stood to meet the French Empire, and as the curtain fell on the 1700s, the trailer for the next episode of the 1800s saw the French Revolutionary Wars take a new turn. Next time. Once peace is finally found, Britain becomes the global hegemonic power, policing the other powers of the world. A time of extravagance arrives with the new King George IV, the beginnings of the Regency era. On the back of the advances made by the Industrial Revolution, we begin to see some of the most landmark discoveries and inventions of any time, great steps forward from the pre-industrial era to this wonderful age of technology that we live in today. The Sailor King finally pushes through the abolition of slavery, and we enter the times of the great Queen Victoria, the longest reigning monarch of any until that time, only surpassed now by her great-great-granddaughter, the current monarch, Queen Elizabeth II.